Commonwealth Club of California welcomes to its distinguished forum Dwight D. Eisenhower, President of the United States of America. This happy occasion preserves unbroken a tradition which began with President Theodore Roosevelt. The great and the near great have addressed this audience, but tonight we welcome the man whom history will record as preeminent among world leaders in the hour of greatest need. I have in mind the rapid succession of communist aggressions as millions of people were enveloped behind the far-reaching Iron Curtains. I have in mind the stalemate of futility in Korea, the rampaging inflation in our homeland, which was eating up the savings of the thrifty and throttling the motors of our free enterprise economy. Here then is the man trained in war, who will be acclaimed by future generations as the man who laid the foundations of peace. And more, he is our President, whom we love with a deep and abiding affection.
Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which put together today's program. Along with the staff at the Commonwealth Club, the tech staff that's helping to put together all these online programs. We've done really dozens and dozens of them since the COVID crisis began. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Susan Eisenhower, who's here with us today. She's the granddaughter of President Eisenhower, and she's written a great book, How Ike Led. It's like a U-2 spy plane overview of the principles that led his presidency, but with a young girl's point of view on the man himself, and it's really quite a combination, and it's a nice combination because it also is the combination that you lived your life at, Susan, because you're a political analyst, et cetera. You've lived your life this way, but in addition to that, you knew him personally for many, many years. I thought that was interesting. You made it all. He didn't pass away until you were already in college or around that age, right?
Yes.
So welcome everybody, and we're going to get started to talk about President Eisenhower. For those of you who aren't familiar with the dates, he was president from 1953 until 1961. JFK was the president right afterwards, and he was the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. So Susan, first of all, thank you very much for joining us from afar. On our online world that we've all recognized can happen very much more easily than we thought. But tell us a little bit about what inspired you to write the book, because now this is you've been working in this field for a long time as a political consultant, et cetera, and advisor, and you decided to write about your own grandfather's work. It must have been very interesting to try to be objective and subjective at the same time. You did it successfully, but it can't have been easy.
Well, George, first of all, let me thank you so much for the opportunity to be back at the Commonwealth Club. I had the wonderful opportunity of presenting two of my other books at the club in years past, so it's great to be back and to talk about this. And yes, I think the question is a very interesting one. Maybe as part of the disclaimer for our discussion this evening, I should say that as a kid, I was really raised to compartmentalize what I knew about his politics, about the period in which he governed, about the issues that he dealt with. And on the other side, my relationship with him as a grandparent. So this book is really a marriage of those two things, as you said, and it was really quite an experience for me to put it together in one place, because I was continually struck by how we were doing certain things as a family, as he was dealing with some of these crises. So that was interesting. The impetus for why to do it now revolved around three events, I guess. One is that the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II, certainly VJ Day is about to occur, but we had, of course, the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe back in May of this year. Secondly, the Eisenhower Memorial in Washington, D.C. Will be dedicated on September 17th in a much more scaled back version of its original self, but it will nevertheless be open to the public after that date. And then finally, we're going into an election year, and there's always a lot of thinking about the presidency as the most important four-year election occurs. And so I thought that Ike had something to say to us today. And I guess that's the reason I put it together.
Well, he really did. And I found that, I mean, obviously you took it from that angle, but there were so many different elements that were so interesting today. As applicable, one of them that I thought, it's just a small side tangent, but that there were people who said in 1956 that were against him being reelected, saying, well, you're going to actually be electing Richard Nixon. You're not going to be electing Eisenhower because Eisenhower is sick. He just had these heart attacks and so on. And so pretty soon Richard Nixon's going to be the president. The same thing is going on today in the Democratic Party. People are saying, Biden will never be president for more than a month or two. So you're really electing Kamala Harris. So I found it interesting that keeps getting thrown out at people.
Well, of course, I'm not going to speculate on whether there's a difference in approach. But Eisenhower was very conscious of what it would be to be a diminished president. We have to remember that President Wilson, there was really almost a scandal that people in the country didn't know how ill that president was. So Ike was determined not to find himself in that situation for the good of the country. And after he had 3 illnesses during his presidency, and after each one of them, he would give himself a very arduous test, like a round the world trip or a trip to Europe that required lots of meetings and lots of stress. And he'd always tell his advisors, if I don't perform at top level, you have to tell me, because then I'll resign. In any case, that never happened. He became actually rather adroit at managing his time, managing his stress, and generally, positioning himself to get through his second term.
It was interesting, also a small tangent, but that the doctors lied to him about the helium thing, so that he didn't think it was as serious, so that he kind of thought he might have made a different decision in '56 if they had warned him about it. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, one of the biggest decisions about running for a second term, as you point out, is that he'd had a heart attack in 1955. And he had a doctor named General Howard Snyder. And although they were devoted friends and they'd been together in one form or another since the war, Howard Snyder actually drove Granddad up the wall. Because first of all, he hovered. He came up with all sorts of things Eisenhower wasn't allowed to do, including watching the Army-Navy football game in real time, because Howard Snyder decided it was going to raise the president's blood pressure. Ike really did care about the outcome of that game, by the way. And so it was. I think Howard Snyder was part of the team that kind of wasn't actually really very direct with the president about his ileitis situation. And again, back to your earlier question, Ike was not going to be a diminished president.
Yeah.
And so he might well have decided differently. But I think he really, at the end of the day, my grandmother intervened for the first time, I think, since the early part of their marriage, and encouraged him to run again because she thought that he would probably die of another heart attack watching everything from the sidelines. you know,
It's a
you
tough
got to watch
decision.
out for that high blood pressure.
Well, I find it interesting the way your grandmother's decision was much more easy to understand. The doctor's decision was, this is the guy who's making all these decisions about the war in Korea and about this. And, I mean, all these big decisions, and you're worried about him watching a football game. Even if he takes it too seriously, it seemed a little bit ludicrous.
Well, I told that story in the book in the context of how an extraordinary amount of power, how that often warps the relationships you have with other people. It doesn't mean that it makes them terrible, but it does change things. And the doctors, for some reason, I love this expression, actually tried to handle this man, which would only make him more wound up, I'm sure, because he was a guy who was used to making big decisions and was perfectly capable of facing any difficult news. As a matter of fact, in his last years of life, I saw this so often, how brave he was and how ready he was to take whatever was coming. As a matter of fact, he even volunteered for some rather exotic treatments for his condition because he thought it might help people after he was gone. But this wasn't anybody you weren't straightforward with. I just want to say that for the record.
Yeah, and it's a good transition because before we get to the big issues that he faced, I think it'd be good to talk about these personal relationships that he had, the friendships that he had, the people that kept him grounded, his family, and your own relationship with him. And you have some pictures to show, which include some pictures of yourself with him when you were younger. So we'll get those up on the screen. Okay, so there's the picture we've been showing. This is him at right around the end of World War II, right?
Yes, this picture was taken in 1945. By that time, he had his 5th star. And I think it's a lovely picture. I think he looks tired, though. I don't know if you'd agree, but he looks content. If the picture were full length, you would see that he's wearing only a single bar of ribbons and 5 stars on his shoulder. He was not one to walk around like a Soviet general with medals that went all the way down to their waist. I like this picture because I think he looks approachable, though I would say tired. And that's got to be a fairly accurate assessment, since it's impossible to know how you could be working 100 hours a week or 130 hours a week, sometimes up all night, up in the middle of the night, and not come out of a 3-year stint like that really, deeply tired. And
in 45, how old was he? He was born in the...
He was born in 1890.
1890.
So he would have been 55 years old. As a matter of fact, if you look at pictures when he was president of Columbia University, he actually looks younger than he does in that picture, even though it was it was another 5 years later.
Yeah. Well, he gave a lot of energy. So the next picture is a picture of you.
Oh.
and this is you as a teenager with him, and a horse, right?
Oh, yes. Is there a horse in that picture? I can't see it from here, but...
Seems like there's a back of a horse.
Well, perfect.
Maybe not.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I became an amateur photographer, and we have in our family collections all sorts of these homemade things. What I like about that picture is somebody else took a picture of Ike taking a picture of me. And I don't know, every time I see this picture, it makes me smile because of this bald head of his that my grandmother always said she loved to roll over at night in bed and, pat his little bald head.
Yeah.
But if there's a horse in the picture, and is from this standpoint, I can't quite see it, but I was the family horseback rider. And so this was a bond we had because he loved horses. And they were the only animals on his farm that he indulged in any way, shape, or form. He was cattle were cattle, and And he certainly didn't like barnyard cats, but he loved these horses. And so I think it's a rather sweet picture.
And you have a short story in your book about when you were around 11 and the horses got away and he had just put in a putting green, his special putting green. You might tell that story because I think it also shows your relationship nicely.
Well, I think the story says a lot about Ike's compassion and my lifetime guilt, because he just put in a putting green, and he put the putting green in because he wanted to have some privacy while he practiced his putting. Otherwise, he'd have had to have gone to the Gettysburg Country Club, which he enjoyed doing and seeing people. But, you know, there wasn't actually any privacy in those events. People came out to watch him golf and the rest of it. So one evening I was padlocking a gate, and 5 of the horses on the farm pushed against the gate, sort of almost knocked me over, and then went running all around the lawn in front of my grandparents' sitting area where they always sat in the evening. And all 5 of these horses are running around like crazy and circling here and going there, and then made a huge sweep across his golf green. And I was more than in a state of panic. Everybody came out of the fields, field hands, Secret Service, everybody. And we were trying to round up these animals. We finally did. And then I had to go in and face the music. And not only had they ruined my grandfather's golf green, but I was late for dinner. So this was this was one of those moments in childhood that you don't forget. So I walked in. He always sat in a swivel chair, and he swiveled around. And he looked at me and he said, "You know what I said to your grandmother? Wow, I haven't seen horses run like that since I was a kid in Abilene, Kansas." And of course, I apologized after that, but I never heard of it again. And it was a very smart move on his part, because the guilt would be lingering. And I was careful never to make a mistake like that again. But he was very nice not to bring it up or to hold it against me or hold it over my head, because I think he knew I was devastated and wouldn't do it again.
It's one of those classic experiences that you know is in a Disney cartoon for children. You know, that the child makes that mistake, you know, of irresponsibility, and then
Yes.
you know, in the ones where the parents are good, they do what Ike did, and where they're bad, they look like a witch. So.
Well, George, I'd add one more thing, is that I had the great good sense to apologize profusely and to take full responsibility. And I think that went down very well. I fear I would have had a significant ongoing lecture about personal accountability had I not done so.
But you'd already learned that lesson, I'll bet.
Yeah, I'd learned that one already. Yeah.
So here he is. He's painting a picture. I assume that you're in that picture. But he
Yes,
was a
it's
painter.
actually, you can see from the postcard he's painting from, the photograph, that it's my mother and 3 of my 4 siblings. My youngest sister was born in 1955 after that portrait was painted. But it was taken at Camp David, and I guess one of the helpers at Camp David came in and took a picture of him doing that. But he took up painting actually after the war. He sort of followed Winston Churchill's example. He was intrigued by how much painting the prime minister did while he was trying to get his head together. And then also his own portrait painter gave him some oil paints as a present, and I took it up then, and then became really very attached to this pastime because he found it centered him. And while he was concentrating on the painting, he was allowing his mind to work through some very difficult problems.
Yeah, and you have a short story in the book about how he had an exhibit at an art museum, and he told somebody that there's only one reason that they're being shown here, and that's because I was president, right?
They'd never give a guy like me an exhibit for paintings that look like this. Well, exactly. He was very modest, unlike Churchill, who really took his painting so seriously that he wanted to be regarded almost as a professional. Ike did it to give away his gifts, and he gave his cabinet members paintings of them. He painted all of his wartime colleagues. He actually even painted Prince Charles and Princess Anne for the Queen of England, and always with full apologies about their execution. But actually, he had some talent, I think.
Yeah, we have a picture here of what he did with Churchill's. The picture of Churchill. That's the next picture. Yeah, it's quite talented. It's not, it's not amateur.
Not bad.
Yeah.
And the other charming thing about this painting is that he actually was able to present it to Prime Minister Churchill when Churchill, he just stepped down, but he was visiting in the United States. And there's a wonderful picture of Churchill sort of looking it over like, Churchill the painter would. Actually, Ike also painted Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, who was one of the big personalities he worked with during World War II. And it's a lovely, lovely painting that hangs today in the British Embassy in Washington, D.C.
Yeah. So you said it's one of his interesting personalities. He's sort of a frenemy, as they would call him now, right?
Something like that.
They got along, but they were enemies too. So, and the next picture is one that he gave to you, the next painting. Yeah, there's a little story with this one, right?
Yeah, there's a story about this one. I often stood behind him when he was at the easel. He had in addition to his retirement years, he always insisted on having a studio somewhere nearby. So in the White House, it was on the second floor overlooking Lafayette Park. Mm-hmm. And it was around that time that I was standing behind him, admiring his work. Now, this is a landscape. I don't know what the scene is, but as I said before, he painted usually from postcards. And these landscapes he did were always serene. And it's been noted that there's something ironic about it because probably every brushstroke is full of some kind of turbulence he's trying to make sense of. This painting at the bottom is dated DE 1957. And in 1957, many things happened, but I was intrigued when I looked at the back of it that it says to Susan, 1958. Mm-hmm. So that means it's likely a painting that was done, first of all, during the Little Rock crisis, when Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to desegregate Little Rock High School and to escort 9 African Americans to start school in that September. And then right after that, of course, was Sputnik, and the Soviet Union launched its first artificial satellite, or I should say the world's first artificial satellite into space. So I look at this painting and I think, wow, those brush strokes must have, provided some relief during those times of great controversy and crisis.
Well, we're going to go back to that. I mean, people talk about October surprises, and in 1956, your grandfather certainly got 2 really huge ones. But let's finish the pictures, and then we'll go. And by the way, for the audience, if you have any questions, just send them in through the chat room, and we'll ask them tonight. We got yours, Gary, and we'll get to the Korean conflict a little bit later. So next picture is, yes, and that's you, right?
That's me.
Yeah.
Well, I look like I'm terribly thoughtful, and he looks very kind. And I like that picture because I've always wanted people to know that he had some very, very tough decisions in some very dark times during our history. When you think about what he saw and what mm-hmm. he had to order during the war, but he never became hard or cynical. And I think as both a family member and as an analyst, I think it's remarkable. It says a lot about his character.
It seems to me one of the hardest things to do to make those decisions, we'll get to D-Day later, to know that at the best, so many people will die. And at the worst, you don't even succeed at what you're trying to accomplish, and even more people will die. The right. people who've made those decisions for us, I think is why they get admired for decades and even centuries to come, because it's so crucial. And your grandfather's certainly one of those. The next picture, we have a couple of pictures of him, I think now. Here's a picture of him as a young man on a baseball team, just so that you can see him before he's bald, right?
Yeah, that's right. I was looking, it's always fun to see Ike with a full head of hair. So he is, George, maybe you could describe which one he is, because I'm not sure that.
I think this is him right here. Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
He was, this is the Abilene High School, and he was on the baseball team. He was a very good baseball player, but I think his real passion was football.
Mm-hmm.
And he lost his way for a little while when he broke his knee and was unable to continue playing football at West Point because he had played against Jim Thorpe, as a matter of fact, in the Army versus Carlisle game, and he was regarded as a very fast, effective football player, and that was very discouraging for him, and he had to learn how to snap out of that downer after taking up cigarettes, of course.
Well, there's one tangent. Wasn't planning on going there, but I thought it was interesting that you mentioned that all leaders aren't people who just have obeyed their whole time. That he was kind of a not a bad boy, but he certainly got himself in trouble when he was at West Point, and he didn't even go there to become a soldier. He just went there for the free education. Another very interesting tangent.
Well, he shared that with Ulysses S. Grant. A lot of great leaders turned out to be civilians who had never imagined themselves as soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
I think, George, one thing that's worth mentioning, especially in the context of West Point, is that he grew up in a very religious household.
Mm-hmm.
And the Eisenhowers were pacifists. They were God-fearing pacifists. There wasn't an Eisenhower who fought in the Civil War, though they named Ike's uncle Abraham Lincoln Eisenhower because they wanted to express their views.
Mm-hmm.
But they were conscientious objectors. So you can imagine the family feelings when Ike goes off to West Point because he can't wait any longer for his younger brothers to put him through college.
Yeah. Fascinating. And those want more details? It's in the book. The next picture is meeting with Khrushchev, which was your grandfather had a very interesting idea. And you mentioned it. We were talking about it earlier. And I don't think very many people know about this, but he was, when he was talking about the distinctions between what was going on during the Cold War, it wasn't a matter of capitalism versus socialism or even communism. It was.
Oh yes, he says actually in the speech to the Commonwealth Club that it's really about openness, democracy versus authoritarianism, and then he goes on to say it's about a free and open society as opposed to a closed and secretive society, and I just thought that was rather intriguing.
Yeah, because it's a lot of times in order to fight the enemy that's perceived, you become like the enemy in closing off and becoming secretive yourself sometimes. But it's interesting.
George, if I could add two things
Sure.
If I could add something here about this picture. This is in 1959, and even though they're smiling, the United States at this point has been thrown into what is called the Berlin Ultimatum. So Nikita Khrushchev is currently threatening the United States with punitive action over Berlin. And if it had turned into war, there would be no way to defend Berlin with conventional weapons. So it might have turned nuclear. So today we have those kinds of standoffs, but Eisenhower actually invited Khrushchev to come to the United States, and Khrushchev was here for 10 days. And during that time, the Soviet premier was subjected to Eisenhower's grandchildren as a way to soften him up. And all I can say is that the future of the world hung in the balance as to whether or not we were going to be well behaved that afternoon. We apparently managed to save the world for the first and last time. No, I shouldn't make jokes about this. It was a very serious time.
Oh, yes.
But after the trip, the Soviets did lift the ultimatum with some agreement to continue to talk about it at a summit in Paris.
So we'll talk about the U-2 right now, as long as we've got Khrushchev on the screen too. We're going to do it later, but let me do it right now. So there's this U-2 incident that's famous. But what's also very fascinating about what you said is how much information President Eisenhower had about what the Russians actually had done and what they hadn't, and that he knew that everybody was lying about the missile gap and this other stuff that was driving the Cold War. It was perfectly clear that they did not have a force that we needed to worry about at that time when that was going on, because they had the information. So maybe say a little bit about what happened.
Well, it's all intriguing, and actually Sputnik is tied up in this because, we just had the dawn of the space age during his administration, and there were no rules for outer space at all. It was undecided legally whether or not sovereign airspace would extend all the way out into outer space. And so through an agreement with the Soviet Union, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to launch artificial satellites in 1957. So to the Eisenhower administration, there was no surprise about that.
Mm-hmm.
The point of free access to space, which is what Eisenhower strongly endorsed and had to make it possible for the free use of satellites in orbit.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason those satellites were so important to Eisenhower is because it would help avert a surprise attack.
Mm-hmm.
And before the satellites could be launched into free access of space, he proposed overflights for the United States and the Soviet Union to fly their aircraft over each country's territory to assure that there would not be a surprise nuclear attack.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I just have to say about the Sputnik thing, the administration knew they were going to launch their satellites and didn't even feel very badly. As a matter of fact, sort of encouraged the Soviets to go first behind the scenes without telling them anything. But they were sort of hoping the Soviet Union would go first so that the Soviet Union would accidentally establish the precedent for free use of outer space.
Mm-hmm.
So not long after that, the satellites we had been working on, the Corona project, got launched, and we could tell from space and from the U-2 exactly what quite precisely what the Soviet military buildup looked like, including the number of rockets they had. Nevertheless, Sputnik opened the way for opposition to the Eisenhower administration and preparation for the 1960 presidential campaign.
Yes.
Turned into a scandal, which is known as the Missile Gap. And the Democrats were accusing the Eisenhower administration of failing to keep up with the huge lead the Soviet Union allegedly had in rockets and nuclear weapons and that kind of thing. It turned out to be a fiction. We were way ahead of the Soviet Union. And the only way we could eventually tell that were by the two programs that Eisenhower initiated, the U-2 and also the satellite program for reconnaissance purposes.
Yeah, your version of the story made me think he must have had some pretty good lawyers on his team advising, well, if you do it this way then and let the Soviets go first, then this is going to set the precedent that's going to allow us to get what we want, which is this free and open space thing. And if we go first, they'll say, we're trying to dominate, and then it won't work. So,
well, we had a hint, too, because we had proposed the Open Skies Treaty at the Geneva summit in 55, and the Soviet Union absolutely rejected it. I mean, they would have had overflights over the United States, but they didn't want this mutual overflight business because they thought we were going to use it for targeting purposes. So you can imagine that if we'd gone into space first, they would well have accused us of going into space for doing what the U-2 is meant to do. It's sort of a complicated story, but it's what I call playing the long game. We took a big political hit but when Sputnik went up before any of our successful satellites, our successful artificial satellites. But in the end, it was what began to establish a framework for space, which allowed all of the tremendous amount of development to take place without conflict.
Well, he was the right man in the right place because he certainly had the long game in his mind a lot, and he had plenty of experience with it. The other thing that was very interesting, also tangential about your book, was that because he had so much dealing with the Russians during World War II and so on and so forth, that he was in a very good position to have a realistic idea about what they were up to and what they would do and what they wouldn't do. And he did not consider them so fanatic that they would destroy themselves, that they were somewhat rational players.
Yeah, my father had a tremendous sense of humor, I must say. I asked him what he thought was one of the biggest intelligence conclusions of the 1950s, and my late father said that the Soviets were not early Christian martyrs.
Yeah, yeah.
In other words, the assessment is that the Soviet leadership wanted to stay in power, and so that's a very big difference between wanting to launch a preemptive strike.
Right.
That's a big analytical difference.
Big. Well, you just mentioned your father. Great story about the conversation he had with President Eisenhower, his father, about Korea. He wanted to go to Korea. He wanted to go back with his troops to Korea. And that's pretty serious. You didn't find out about that when you were young. I assume you found that out later. Did you find it out when your father was still alive, or did you read
yes.
it?
Yes,
Oh,
yes.
okay.
George, the story, to summarize it, is when General Eisenhower becomes President Eisenhower. Now he's not just a five-star general. As a matter of fact, he gave up his Army commission to run for president, because we don't have generals as president of the United States. So he suddenly is the commander in chief, and he is my father, who was a graduate of West Point too, an Army officer who was stationed in Korea, comes back for his father's inauguration, and then they have a very serious talk. And Ike says, you have to decide whether you're going to go back to your unit in Korea, or I'll command you to stay in the United States. But here's the deal. If you go back to Korea, you need to carry a handgun with you at all times, and you have to promise me, this is an order, promise me that you will never be taken as a hostage or be in a situation where you could put the President of the United States in any jeopardy. So what that really adds up to is that my father agreed to commit suicide if he were in a situation where he was going to be taken hostage. And it sounds like a really, by that time, my father and mother already had 3 kids. I was the third of that group. As I say, my sister Mary came along in 1955. So this is several years before. And, it's kind of stunning today. We think actually that our leaders ought to be sending their kids overseas, but the potential for blackmail and to put the President of the United States in a position that would undermine the security of the United States was unacceptable for those 2 Army officers, and my father agreed. Thankfully, he lived to the age of 91, so he came home from Korea without having to take such a drastic and tragic step.
It's such a telling detail about the difference, I think, in time and place and what they had already gone through with the Depression and the war, that this father and son can make this deal and both understood that that's the only thing that you could do.
Well, and also they were both military men, and it's called doing your duty.
Right.
Because the mission always supersedes any individual desires, or however you'd like to put it. And I think it is moving. I sort of think that story is important too, because to understand Dwight Eisenhower is to understand that he was trained as a military mind. He was a strategic leader. He was somebody who was highly self-disciplined. He didn't like histrionics. He didn't like over-emotionalism. He believed in self-discipline and process. And process for him was extremely important, because he didn't want his subordinates out freelancing, and he certainly didn't want to make any impetuous, uninformed decision. And that is all training that comes out of a lifelong experience in the military, especially at the highest levels.
You have great stories about how he dealt with the whole atomic weaponry issue and everything, making 3 different commissions. He kind of did it in this very elaborate way. But let's move on to the next question, the next picture. And yeah, so here he is talking to the soldiers. You have several great stories, not only at the time during World War II, but afterwards, 10 years afterwards. I think the 82nd Airborne, he met with them, and he had met with them. I think this is the group that he's meeting with now on their way off to fly. And I think it's interesting, because I don't think people realize how personal he made this, and how difficult that must have been to do that, to look him in the face.
Well, Yeah, well, this picture's taken on June 5th, just as these paratroopers are about to take off to the Normandy coast to unknown fates.
Mm.
And part of the reason I think this particular picture is so wonderful is look at his face and how he's smiling at those boys.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's particularly noteworthy because the airborne drop, his decision about the airborne drop was probably one of the toughest of that whole Normandy enterprise. And the reason for it is rather simple.
Mm-hmm.
His technical expert, Air Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, a British air marshal who was responsible for the 24,000 paratroopers who dropped, warned Ike about General Eisenhower about a week before the D-Day assault was to take place, that he thought that the paratroopers should be canceled because the Germans had reinforced a position, and he thought it was dangerous, and that between 50 and 70% of paratroopers and glider troops would be lost in this exercise.
Mm-hmm.
So Ike went into a room for 2 hours and decided against that recommendation because the paratroopers were central for opening a number of pathways off Utah and Omaha Beach.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what's moving about this picture is that having made that decision a week earlier and having written a note for his pocket that says, if the landings fail, the responsibility is mine and mine alone.
Mm-hmm.
He goes out and he looks these paratroopers in the eyes,
mm-hmm.
Thinking in his mind that his technical expert says between 50 and 70%
mm-hmm.
of these boys are not coming home.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought there was another thing I think you detail is the fact that the original D-Day plans, when he got his hands on them, he changed them and doubled the size of the invasion and added this plan about the paratroopers landing. And fortunately, the advisor wasn't right that it was 4% that died and 10% were wounded or something like that. Still a high amount, but not at all what he was. And they succeeded, and everyone assumed that without that, the overall it could have been an overall disaster. I mean, everyone
That's
knew
right. Well, the paratroopers were the linchpin of the operation.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I can tell you pretty much what Eisenhower was saying at that point, and
mm-hmm.
it's because we know it, that that is the 101st Airborne.
Mm-hmm.
We know it because a number of them came back and told us what was being talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And he was asking them about home.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't giving them a pep talk about getting on a plane and dropping behind lines in Normandy. He was talking to them about home.
Mm-hmm.
And I once asked my father, why would he do that? I mean, and my father, a military officer, says, well, they knew what they were about to go do, and they were probably scared half to death. So imagine that smile,
mm-hmm.
and a man who came out and had the courage to look them in the eyes before they took off. And they'd say, don't worry, General, we're going to whip Hitler. And, a great exchange, really.
Yeah. Very moving. There are a lot of moving tales in your story of your grandfather. So I think the next picture is that's him at a D-Day remembrance years later. Do you know about how old he was at this time?
Well, I'll tell you, he would have been 75.
Mm-hmm.
It was D-Day plus 20 years. That picture was taken. He gave an interview to Walter Cronkite, and they drove all through the Normandy coastline.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this is the American cemetery before it had been completely finished.
Mm-hmm.
It was a long process to put that cemetery together, but this was the first time I could come back. During the presidency, the 10th anniversary of D-Day occurred in 1955 when he was president, and he did not want to politicize the what's really hallowed ground. So he sent a gift to the people of Normandy and then spent the day in seclusion. But here he comes back and he's talking to Walter Cronkite. But look at the pain in his face.
Mm-hmm.
All of those kids who didn't make it, and he was responsible for the decisions that may have cost some of those people their lives. So then Walter Cronkite says, what do you think when you sit here? And I'm very moved by this. He said, they gave us another chance. And he says, the question is, what are we going to do with that chance? And I, in a way, think that we're at a crossroads today where we have to ask ourselves, what are we going to do with the chance we have by the time we move beyond this crisis? Are we going to be a more united country, or are we going to allow our divisions to separate us as a people?
That's really a great segue. We have actually audio of President Eisenhower. He spoke at the Commonwealth Club here 60 years ago, and as you know, and I have a little clip, maybe about 3 minutes long, where everybody can hear his voice. I know that a lot of people are not aware of it. It is not as commonly heard as President Kennedy's voice, for example, with the clips. But the way he says what he says is almost as important as what he says. And I think it's very relevant for today, just as you were saying. So as soon as that clip gets started, we'll listen to it. But I find it fascinating, as we were saying a little bit earlier, this generation of men. I mean, my father was in the war. He went, dropped off in North Africa, went up through Italy and Sicily.
Yeah.
Is it ready? Just go ahead and run it. Yeah.
I'm glad to be here this evening to sustain your perfect score as having as a speaker every president of the United States since this club was founded at the beginning of the century.
Sorry, we don't have live audiences right now.
But my approach gives you no reason to abandon the practice. Moved by a wisdom developed out of experience, the organizer of this club devised for their new creation a noble and necessary purpose: better government in their state. Its energizing spark was the belief that, and I take these words from the documents of the time, California suffers greatly because the best elements of the population fail to cooperate for the common good as effectively as the bad elements cooperate for evil purposes. The dedication of that group and the unremitting efforts of its membership to pursue the course of sound government have remained undimmed for the almost 6 decades of the club's existence. The word Commonwealth signifies a group united by common interests. But equally significant is the fact that in the political realm, a commonwealth, as Mr. Webster defines it, has come to mean generally, if not always, an association based upon free choice. Tonight, I shall try to apply to some aspects of the world of international affairs the founding principle of this organization, that this state suffered because of the failure of some elements to cooperate as effectively for good as others did for evil. No groups, no matter how well-intentioned, can cooperate fruitfully unless there is first established a firm basis of common understanding. This the founders of your club recognized by noting that one of the great difficulties was that different groups in California did not know each other. They were separated at that time by wide areas, and they also distrusted each other. Just as the California of 1903, the year your club was founded, was a far cry from the Commonwealth of California today, so the world, as we turned into the 20th century, is scarcely recognizable as the one we know in 1960.
And the same issues are here. And as you said, can people cooperate? One of the big issues that you talked about in the book in several places is that your grandfather was really not either a Democrat or a Republican. And so he was a moderate. And he worked together quite often. In fact, in his cabinet, he had Democrats, so on as used to be done. And it seems to me he was worried about the extremists at both ends. And those extremists at the time, on the right, there was the John Birch Society, there was the McCarthy anti-communists. On the left, there were the communists and people who were trying to help the Soviet Union to succeed, and other groups that were extreme. And he tried to run through the middle. And he was, of course, criticized for not moving fast enough by one group and criticized for going too fast by the other groups. But he definitely went right up the middle. And I've often thought today, and it's interesting because it's almost like the Democrats and the Republicans, without knowing it, shot themselves in their own feet by gerrymandering all of the congressional districts. They did it not to cause what happened back in the 80s, but they did it in order to ensure that they all got reelected. But what that did was it made the primary elections, the actual election, because their group was always going to win in their thing, as a result of which it pushed towards the extreme because the primaries worked for extremists. And we could undo that process. And both parties, it seems to me, ought to be interested in that. But if they don't get interested in it, we could use another President Eisenhower that said, what about getting the Democrats that are moderate and the Republicans that are moderate to work together and do that instead? You know, that run something, because people, and I think about 60% of the voters, it seems from the polling, are right in that situation. So it's very interesting. I think that's the nice framework for all the different issues he covered. We have a couple of questions here, so there's plenty of things that we're going to cover. I mean, so many issues that he did it. But let's ask the questions that were asked. Like Gary Landsman asked, what was Ike's strategy to prevent a flare-up of the Korean conflict? So there was a stalemate going on in Korea. And he came in as a general, and a lot of people thought, well, he'll win the war for us. But that's not how he went about doing it. Because he's very realistic about that, about the Iron Curtain countries, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how he dealt with that.
Well, of course, it's a long story. They always are.
Yeah.
But I think if you were to look at his, well, let me start by saying that after he was elected president, he went to Korea, as he promised during the campaign, and he actually took a helicopter ride over the terrain. He got pretty close to the front, as a matter of fact, if he wasn't right on the front, which I would have thought was rather dangerous for a newly elected president. But he wanted to see the terrain. He wanted to see the lay of the land firsthand. I think the terrain already worried him a lot, especially given the positions of both sides. And he thought that this is just not a winnable war, unless it becomes a big war and big weapons are used. He just didn't think it was going to succeed. And he was very much against wars without an end that would bleed not just human lives, but it would bleed the economy, and it would bleed energy and attention. And he set about, working out negotiations that led to the armistice. But this later became a great point of contention, as you know, between those who were in favor of making the world safe for America to engage in small wars versus Eisenhower's view that small wars start small but can get big. They can get big fast if your adversary is losing. And in this particular case, of course, later the big adversary was the Soviet Union that had weapons to match our own, including the hydrogen bomb that had been developed just before I came to the presidency. Yes, they managed. It turned out that there was, it wasn't just the United States that was war weary, that there was some flexibility that seemed to be present among our enemies in that fight, and so an armistice was achieved. It's still in place, and I guess that's the last chapter of the Korean situation. Is what are we going to do, and are we going to stay in Korea, or are we going to ever be able to negotiate some kind of proper end of that war?
Right. And there was one of the things another big issue that he dealt with after the war was how to deal with Germany. And we won't go into a lot of detail about that because there's so many things to cover. But he did say something interesting, which you recorded in your book. He said, I will consider our policy towards Germany successful if 50 years later it's a thriving democracy. And in 1995, which was 50 years after he said that at the end of the war, was only a couple of years after Germany had reunited as all one country and certainly is a thriving democracy. So whatever his long-range strategies were, that one worked. I mean, that one's right on point. And it's amazing. The Chinese, we're told the Chinese look ahead 100 years. We're told the Russians look ahead with these things. But we have had presidents that have done that. And they can't keep the policies in place if somebody takes them away. But they can set the policies in a way that they make enough sense that people continue them. And I think a lot of those were done. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say that I think that of course, he was a strategic leader during the war and as president. And I think he was always looking for sustainable strategies. Mm-hmm. And, I like the idea of a sustainable strategy because it's a good strategy if it stays in place and meets the needs over a longer period of time. Mm-hmm. So many of the things we call strategies today have like a one-term, half-life, and mm-hmm. and then we have to, or it can go on for longer than that, of course. But then big course corrections have to be made, and I think that actually the Ike's accomplishments hold up pretty well over the decades, and he was playing the long game anyway. Mm-hmm. When he liberated that concentration camp,
right,
and was horrified by what he saw. I mean, so shocked. He said he still can't find words for how he felt, and he was a very articulate writer. Mm-hmm. His first reaction is, "What are people going to say in 50 years? Mm-hmm. They're going to say that the Holocaust never happened unless we chronicle it now." And mm-hmm. so he sent everybody, including my father, into those camps to photograph it. Congressmen came from the United States. That was all on his orders.
Yeah. The other element that we were talking about trust. It seems to me that you have a problem in our trying to come to an agreement with each other today. Everybody has their own point of view, which has always been true. We're getting used to democracy. That is, everybody gets to have their point of view. Some people are very mad at the educated elite for trying to run things based on principles and so on and so forth. It's against the way they would want to do it. So you need to have a persuasive argument about it. And in addition to that, you take all the groups and you say, what is it that we have in common? I think one of the things that we've learned over the years is that, it's all right if we educate women. It's not going to be the end of society. In fact, our society is now better. Is more productive. It's not bad if we educate all kinds of people. Everybody should be educated. Although anybody who doesn't want to be educated, that's another argument. Maybe they don't need to be educated. If they don't want to, that's fine. But you have a certain element of what it is that we can have in common and say, if that's our goal, and we all agree, not all, but like 70% agree on those goals, then we can trust each other if we just stick to those goals. This is what we're going to work on together, and the rest of it is. But people in politics want to promise what they're going to accomplish, and nobody can promise what they're going to accomplish in politics because there's a whole bunch of people you have to get to agree with you.
That's true. That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
Eisenhower once said, I think it was at the beginning of his administration when he was describing a problem, he described it as the fear in the hearts of men. Yeah. I think he understood that what underlies a lot of this lack of trust is fear, just to your point. Mm-hmm. And so it's the role of a responsible leader to put into perspective the fears we may have versus how dire things really are. And we've gotten to the point in this country now where everything's a threat.
Yeah.
Well, I'm really sorry, but not all threats are equal.
Yeah.
And some are more important than others. And I think this is one thing a reader might get from this book is the way a true strategist thinks about these things is to understand what the fundamental questions are. Because nobody is effective if they take on absolutely every issue. But what are the ones that are going to what is the long pole in the tent that's going to keep the tent from collapsing?
Right. And the people who miss that don't realize that the main tent pole is coming down. And the idea about the fear is absolutely right. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we were successful after World War II was the level of confidence in America. Look what we had just accomplished. Yes, there were big, scary things going on. The nuclear weapons were a big, scary thing from our childhoods, as you certainly remember, and several other things. But there was still the confidence that we can meet our problems and overcome them, because we overcame bigger problems already in World War II. So why can't we do these? And I think that the amount of fear that has been generated since 9/11 about this and then the next thing and the next thing, even though there were plenty of terrorism in the 70s and 80s in Europe and America, but it didn't scare people as much. So I think.
Well, that's right. There's a certain amount of political exploitation around fear. Some people in Washington say that if you want to get anything done on Capitol Hill or at the White House, you have to say it's a national security threat. And I have one very cynical friend who calls it threat marketing.
Yeah.
Whatever the case is, you see the early beginnings of that with the missile gap in the story I've written.
Right.
It certainly, we should be vigilant and alert at all times, but we have to also understand that the state of our economy, the moral authority we have as a country, both domestically and internationally, all these things Eisenhower thought were critical to our own national security and military capability, sure, but that wasn't the only thing that was part of our national security.
Right. And because I don't think human nature will change too much, I accept that the politicians will use this threat marketing in order to get ahead. But what I would hope for is that they would at least do like John Kennedy did, was once he won, that he said, well, actually, that it's not as bad as we said, to bring it back down again. I understand that it's just like a game. It's like trash talking in a basketball game. You're trying to upset the other person so that they're not at the top of their game so that you win the game. I mean, in a way, it shows a lack of confidence that you can win the game without doing it, but we won't talk about that because that's the way all games are mostly played. But it would be nice if the politicians would then say, oh, well, I was just kidding, or not I was just kidding, but it's now that I'm here and I found out all the information, it's not as bad as I said, and so we can all go back to feeling a little bit more comfortable. Because that level of fear is really the thing that dissolves society. You just
well, there's another fear there too, which is probably contributed is part of the result of social media and just a whole bunch of cultural factors. But people are very afraid of being seen as weak. Or as a winner or a loser, and these are I don't think my grandfather would understand that at all. He really believed in second chances. And if you believe in second chances, then you don't believe in the whole winner-loser accusations that are hurled at people. But these are attacks on people's motives and their personalities. And I don't think it helps at all. It doesn't help because then people might make ill-informed decisions just so that they are seen to be doing something, when in fact spending more time studying the issue, looking at the background and thinking about the long-term consequences would be more productive.
Well, your grandfather certainly embodied that. One of my maxims in my writing is, everyone is a loser. Winners are just losers with more patience.
No, that's good. Yeah. I like that.
So we have one last question here in time for it, from Evans. how did he find it different to be a leader in the military versus leading in the world of politics and government? And sort of which one was more difficult for him? You addressed that in your book, and I was very interesting.
Well, I'm so happy for that question because there is no question that Dwight Eisenhower had a learning curve when he got into, full-blown retail politics.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, one of the big differences is when you're a five-star general, everybody you outrank everybody,
mm-hmm.
right? And the military is organized in a way to follow orders, and I would say that, and I think it's pretty evident in the book, that as a five-star general, he was remarkably flexible, and he was not like his former boss, General Douglas MacArthur, who, was tough on troops and, was addicted to the attention he received. I wanted to be the un-MacArthur, I think.
Mm-hmm.
In any case, but in any case, I think he described it during the Chief of Staff years, where he says that the biggest job in the military as commander or supreme commander is to think through how he really views things and what his strategy is going to be, and then to bring others along to lead people.
Mm-hmm.
Then he says, but I've noticed from being in Washington that making up your own mind on something is only just the beginning of the problem. And then he outlines all of the various problems there are. You don't know who is connected to who and who has a grudge against who. And it's actually a very, very funny passage. And I think it's probably particularly funny because he wrote it in his diary, which he never thought would get published for all of us to read and enjoy. But you saw some early hiccups in the campaign, and later, mostly in the campaign. But he picked up the algorithm of it pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And I can just say that if we don't understand some of those hiccups, like his staff releasing his speech during the McCarthy encounter in Minnesota, then we're missing the adjustment he had to make.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably anytime any leaks or any staff did not do what they were told to do, this was a big problem with him because it isn't what you do in the military. And so he ran a tight ship in the White House. And believe it or not, I mean, his associates were tremendously respectful of it. I knew many of his associates, and they liked the fact that they were given a lot of leeway. He was a very good person at delegating, but they understood that they had to be personally responsible for the decisions they were making too.
Mm-hmm.
I should add to that, of course, is that Eisenhower had a pretty good sense of who needed the short reins and who he could give more latitude to. But it's a fascinating question, and thank you so much for asking it, because we tend to study Eisenhower the president, or we study Eisenhower the general, but we don't really put the two of them together as much as we should, because this adjustment was a real one, starting with his role as Chief of Staff of the Army.
Yeah.
And going on from there.
The people skills of dealing with so many different kinds of generals, including the really big egotists that he had to deal with in Patton and Douglas MacArthur, who used to be his boss. I mean, that's one thing. But with politicians, he had to learn a whole new set of buttons to push or whatever to understand these people, what drives them. Certainly not truth, certainly not trying to win a war. Win election, yes, well, I can kind of but anyway, I thought you did a wonderful job of showing both sides of that. And it's a great book for those of you who want much more detail. Get it and enjoy it. And I'm sorry that you're all at home and have time to read it. But there it is. It's a great idea for anybody that wants to go back to that period of time. So thank you very much, Susan, for explaining your book and the great pictures of your grandfather and of yourself from your childhood. And so ends another event of the Commonwealth Club in its 118th year of enlightened discussion.
Thank you, George.
My pleasure, Susan. That was great.